on the United States on the United States on the United States Census. For those of you that have done a lot of genealogical work, you've probably spent time with the United States Census, but some of you maybe not. But the United States has done a census on every household going back to the year 1790, and it's been done every 10 years. It was started right after the country was formed, and the House of Representatives wanted to conduct the census so that they were able to determine how many representatives each state got in the U.S. House of Representatives. That very first census in 1790 was very basic. It provided the name of the head of a household and the number of people that were living in that house. And that was about it, not much more info than that. But every 10 years, the census has kind of evolved and more questions in general have been added, so that now the census provides quite a bit of data on every person in the U.S. In 1978, Congress passed what they called the 72-year rule. And that basically said that the census could be used for historical, genealogical, and research purposes only after a lapse of 72 years. So the good news is they made the census available to the general public, but you have to wait 72 years after the census to be able to access it. So the year 2022 was exactly 72 years after 1950. And so that's why last year was the first year that the 1950 census became available for us to look at. The census has been done every 10 years since 1950, but again, we just don't have access to it, and it'll be the year 2032 before we have access to the 1960 census. One of the things that's important to keep in mind as we look at the 1950 census is for every year up until 1950, the census was really done through face-to-face visits by individuals. So the US government every 10 years would hire census takers, or what they called enumerators, and they were in charge of going around to every household or farm in the US and asking the questions and recording it on their forms. Over the years since 1950, that's evolved. It eventually evolved to getting a lot of that census information coming through the mail, starting in 1960. And then now more recently, most of that data is compiled online. And in general, you only get a face-to-face visit if you don't turn in the form either through mail or online, then you might get someone knocking on your door. But in 1950, the census we're going to look at, the entire census was done by people going around, knocking on the doors, and getting the questions answered. I say that because there are errors in the census, and anyone that has looked at a lot of historical census data has probably seen maybe names misspelled in their family or ages that aren't quite right. And the reason for that is sometimes the census taker did not hear the person correctly. They may have misrecorded it or misspelled a name. But the other thing that happened from time to time is if a census taker came around multiple times to a location and still no one was home, they could actually get a family's census information from a neighbor if the neighbor was pretty knowledgeable about the family. But the neighbor may not always know the exact ages of the kids, or they may not know where the husband's parents were born, for instance. And so that's why you sometimes can also see errors in the census. But I would say for the most part, the 1950 census is pretty accurate, and I've been able to find everyone that I've looked for that I knew that was alive in 1950. And if you look at enough census data over the years, you see some funny things. So the census data has everything from the humorous, and here I found Merry Christmas and Frankenstein in the census. So just two brief excerpts here. From Indiana, I found the Christmas family. They had a daughter named Mary. And over in Oklahoma, I found a Frankenstein. So you look at enough census data, you see a lot of funny things. But you also find the future famous. So on this page, I have clipped three excerpts from 1950. All three young men that went on to be famous. The top one here is from the Atlanta, Georgia census. We have the King family. Martin L. Sr. is a Baptist minister, and his 21-year-old son here, Martin Luther King Jr., born in Georgia. The middle one here is from Scranton, Pennsylvania. We see the Biden family and 7-year-old Joe Biden Jr. living with his extended family. His father was an automotive inspector. And one of the interesting things here is I've highlighted that Joe's uncle Frank was living with them. And if you look at his occupation, he was one of the census enumerators. So Joe's uncle was one of the people knocking on the doors, taking the census. And then the final one down here is from New York City and Manhattan. And we see the Trump family, and they've got 4-year-old son, Donald. Donald was born in New York. His dad was born in New York, but his mom was born in Scotland. And his dad was owned a building construction company, and they actually had an Irish nursemaid living with them. So again, everyone that was alive in 1950 that I've looked for, I've been able to find somewhere in the U.S. Census. So before we get into the Rochester data, I just want to place some context about what was going on in 1950. The U.S. population was about 150 million. That's just a little less than half of what the U.S. population is today. But interestingly, Rochester, the 1950 census, the population of the city of Rochester was only 30,000. And I believe it's over 120,000 today. So whereas the U.S. population doubled since 1950, Rochester has gone up by a factor of more than 4. So certainly Rochester has been very dynamic since 1950. 1950 was also the start of the Korean War. Now it started just after the census was taken in 1950. So we're going to look at some military data from the 1950 census, but it's not going to include the Korean War because the date of the 1950 census was April 1st. That doesn't mean that the census taker necessarily visited exactly on April 1st, but everyone was to answer the questions as if it was April 1st in terms of age, occupation, so on. And so April was a little before the Korean War started. Obviously, cost of living was very different. Average cost of a new home was $8,450 in the US, and average wages were $3,210. It was really the year that televisions started exploding. So 14 million new television sets were sold in the US in 1950. And that was a 10-fold increase over the prior year. It was also the first year that credit cards were issued. It was the birth year of Jay Leno, Stevie Wonder, Bill Murray, Julia Serving. And it was also the first time that an African-American played in the NBA for the first time. And then closer to home for those of you in Rochester, in 1950, Mayo Clinic researchers and Rochester residents, Edward Kendall and Philip Hinch, were 2 of the 3 individuals that won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of cortisone. 1950 was clearly the start of a dynamic period. It was the first census after World War II. And so you had a lot of the GIs coming back after World War II, and the U.S. government created the GI Bill, which allowed returning veterans to receive subsidies in terms of going to college. It made college affordable for many young men for the first time. And the GI Bill also offered home ownership, home loan subsidies. And so a lot of GIs were able to come back and buy homes for the first time. Automobiles and roads were just becoming much better and more prominent around this period of time. So there was a lot of construction for new homes. Suburbs were starting to be built. It's kind of the beginning era for when people would commute longer into work, maybe live in a suburb and commute into a city. It was still not typical for women to be in the workplace, but you do start seeing some of that in the 1950 census of more women with jobs. That was certainly on the increase. And, you know, farming was still very prevalent in 1950. It's obviously become less prevalent, less so over time. But in 1950, we'll see the prevalence of a lot of farms, particularly when you get out right outside of the city limits. Just to give a little more feel on what cost of living was like, I just clipped some things from the 1950 Sears catalog. You could buy a boy's flannel shirt for $2.24, a women's dress shirt for $1.89, a women's raincoat you could purchase for $4.98, a women's wool winter jacket for $8.98, and you could buy a quality tire for your car for $12.85. I don't know if any of you have bought new tires recently, but if you have, you know that cost of living has gone up dramatically. I give you all that because we're going to be looking at some income data from Rochester from 1950, and just want to give you some perspective there. So now I'm just showing a sample of what a 1950 census form looked like. And this particular form is for a community in Wisconsin, but the form is identical for what was used in Rochester and throughout the United States. And it was really broken into two parts, a top part and a bottom part. So what I'm showing is what the form looked like that the census taker would go around and transcribe. This is the top part. And the top part should include the names of everyone. And each page here has 30 individuals on it. And this is cut off. I've just got an excerpt here, but you start seeing people listed here. And, you know, this is the head of the household, his wife. I've put this on here because I've not analyzed every single thing on the census, but I've picked out certain questions from the census. So the ones that I've analyzed, one of the questions was, do you live on a farm? Yes or no? So I analyzed that. Here's the question, where were you born? And the answer here is either going to be a state. If someone was born in the US, it's just going to list the state. And if they were not born in the US, it's going to list the country they were born in. Further to the right, there was a yes or no question on whether they were looking for work or not. So we're going to analyze that data. And then on the far right, you see employment information. One question asks for your job title, and the next one, what industry you worked in. So it doesn't list the name of the company you work for, but it does list the industry. So again, this top form is used for everyone. Over on the left here, you see that a couple of people on here have circles by the number. There's a 1 circled here and a 6 circled here. And the reason for this is on the bottom form, there are additional supplemental questions that are asked only for 1 out of every 5 people. So the 1 and the 6 here represent the people that are earmarked for questions on the bottom. So this next page here, I show what the bottom form looks like. And you see a circled 1 and a circled 6 here. Those correspond to the same people we saw up top. So unfortunately, in 1940, the census asked every single person in the census where their parents were born. But in 1950, it only asked 1 out of every 5 people. So here we get the info on where parents were born. And this is not going to list the state. So it's either going to say United States or the foreign country. This supplemental part also asks education level. You see an S8 there. That means an 8th grade education, secondary 8. If you see a C in front of the number, that's the number of years of college that person had. And then over on the right, we get income information, household income information. And then on the far right, you see military service. And there are 3 questions there that are all yes or no. Did you serve in World War II? Yes or no. World War I, or any other military service. So those are the questions that I dug into. Now, it would be too time consuming to go through all 30,000 people in the city of Rochester. But I picked a subsample of enumeration districts, and an enumeration district is roughly 500 to 1,000 people, and the government basically divided up communities into districts, and an enumeration district was of a size that one person that was hired as a census taker could cover that district over approximately six weeks or so, visiting all of the houses or farms and gathering the information. So I did a subset of Rochester by geographically picking different parts of the city, 5 different enumeration districts from Rochester, and then I picked 2 rural townships, Kalmar and Pleasant Grove, one on the northwest side of the county and one on the southeast side of the county. And so this sample that we're going to look at was roughly 5,300 people. But I think in terms of the geographical spread, it's pretty representative. So now let's start looking at what some of the data part of the census tells us. So on this page, I have 3 different columns. The first column here is a summary of statistics from just people in the Rochester area. And then I compare that. I've done this similar analysis on other Minnesota communities, as well as many communities throughout the Midwest. So I've put a Minnesota average and a Midwest average that we can compare Rochester to. And the first thing that kind of jumps out is that Rochester looks very similar to the Minnesota averages and the Midwest averages for about everything other than the 2 that I've highlighted here, the income level and the education level. And probably not too surprising, given the what we know the strong industry base of medical is in Rochester, that it has higher income and education levels. But this helps quantify it from the data that we see off of the census. So I'll just briefly go through these. One of the questions is where you are born. So this born in state category, 74% of the people in Rochester in 1950 were born in the state of Minnesota. As you can see, that number's pretty typical for what you would see as an average in Minnesota or the Midwest. A little bit lower, but not too far off. 4% of the people were foreign born, and that's exactly on the Minnesota and Midwest average. 18% of the people in Rochester had foreign born parents, compared to 19% for the Minnesota average and 15% for the Midwest average. And then you see the average income in the Rochester area in 1950 of about 4,200. That's definitely higher than the Midwest average. Percentage of people looking for work, just 3%. That's very low. In general, the economy in 1950 was very strong. It was post-war boom. A lot of communities from the 1940 census, you could see, had double-digit percentages of people looking for work, but in general, very few people looking for work in Rochester, as well as most communities in the Midwest. This average education level may seem a little low, and I've put an asterisk there. And the reason it's probably a little lower than what you might think is that this particular question was only looked at for people that were 30 years old or older. So it's really what's the education level for people that were born in 1920 or earlier. And it was a little over a 10th grade education for the Rochester area. And again, that's higher than the Minnesota average and quite a bit higher than the Midwest average. But this doesn't necessarily reflect the education level for those under 30, which is going to be a little bit higher, but apples to apples in terms of the way this question was asked about a 10th grade education. But this is pretty high compared to what I typically see. Of all of the Rochester area people I looked at, 21% of them lived on farms. That's exclusively from those 2 rural districts I looked at, and that's not too different from Minnesota and Midwest average. And then you can see the percentage of people that served in World War II, World War I, or any military service, very, very comparable to the overall averages. Where you do start seeing the data, though, to differ is this page breaks down that same data comparing the 5 districts of the people that lived in the city of Rochester compared to the 2 rural districts. And this is really where you start seeing some interesting findings, is that if you lived in the city of Rochester, you were much more likely to have come from somewhere else. I think a couple of reasons for that. In the rural areas, those are mostly farms that have probably been in family for a couple of generations where they own the land, more likely to stay there. And then certainly, given the big employers in the city of Rochester, it was attracting physicians and other people in the medical profession from outside of Minnesota. So I did see a number of people moving from East Coast and other countries into the city of Rochester. A little bit higher percentage foreign born than the rural areas. And then you can see foreign born parents. If you lived in the city of Rochester, it was more than 1 out of every 5 people in the city had foreign born parents, whereas in the rural areas, only about 1 out of every 9 people. And then you start seeing the big difference in both the income level and the education level. The average income for the city of Rochester, over 4,500. That's one of the highest I've seen for Midwest communities. And even the 3,400 for the rural areas of Olmsted County, that's much higher than I typically see in rural areas. I've seen a lot of rural areas where that number's under 3,000. So that's pretty high for rural areas. You can see the percentage of people looking for work a little bit lower in Rochester, education levels higher. But one of the ones that surprised me a little bit is the disparity in the military service between the city and the rural areas. I typically see the cities higher, but not this much disparity. I generally think or hear about 2 reasons why that may be the case. One is if a young man was working on the farm at the time of the war, particularly if they were the primary breadwinner, they may have had a deferment. Given their occupation, it may be more likely that they didn't have to serve in the military. But a secondary reason, and it was certainly the reason for my father. My father grew up in a rural area in Indiana and served in the military during the war, and in his military experience, it was the first time he really ever left his rural area, and he got to see some big cities, experience life a little differently. And then when the war was over, he decided not to move back to the rural area and always lived in cities after that. And that may be another reason why you see these percentages higher for people that live in the city. So I've done a similar analysis for a few other communities that aren't too far away from Rochester: St. Cloud, Winona in Minnesota, and then Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And just compare some of the Rochester data, overall data, to those communities. As you can see, the percentage of people born in the state was lowest in Rochester. Foreign born, Rochester was kind of in the middle. Interestingly, all of these communities were about identical for foreign born parents. But then once again, you see the income levels higher in Rochester. When we look at the employment data for Rochester, there was very little manufacturing in Rochester in 1950. And all these other communities were a little more manufacturing oriented. Particularly Eau Claire had a very large tire factory. There was a refrigerator factory in St. Cloud, and generally those occupations going to be a little bit lower income. Percentage looking for work, Rochester was kind of in the middle. It was at the high end of the education level, and the middle to high end in military service. So now going to turn our attention to what some of the employment questions, what that sort of revealed about the Rochester area. And again, it did not give the name of the company that someone worked for, but just what the industry was. So because I included those 2 rural townships, farming overall was number 1. And in any Midwest community that I look at, if I include any rural areas, farming almost always comes up number 1. But a close second was the medical center. And even in 1950, the Mayo Center was very significant, and I know it's expanded tremendously since then. But even in 1950, that was a very large presence. So medical center number 2 and hospital, number 3. So those two combined, very significant. Construction came up number 4. That's much higher than I typically see it. And even though construction, often I see that top 10 in a community, as I researched this further, the 1950s were a big time for construction in Rochester area. As I mentioned, Rochester's population was growing significantly. The 10-year period that Rochester's population has grown the most was the period of the 1950s. So the 1960 census for Rochester was over 41,000 people. So it was a 36% increase between 1950 and 1960. And that's the largest increase in any 10-year period for the city of Rochester. So a lot of residential construction. 1950 was the year that Mayo started an expansion and started work on the Mayo building. Roads were being built. So construction was pretty significant in 1950. And then hotels. It was interesting to see hotels as a top employer. And obviously, I assume that was driven by the medical presence and the people coming to the clinic there. But some of the names that when I did a little more research, Zumbro, Hotel Brown, Carlton, Arthur, Hotel Martin, Kyler. So a lot of hotels, big employers in 1950, followed by the public schools, which is almost always top 10 for a community. Dairy, which is almost always top 10 for a Minnesota or Wisconsin community. Lumber, either a lumber yard or lumber mill. And then the first sign of any manufacturing was a phonographic factory. I don't believe there's any remnants of that in Rochester today, but between the 1940s and 1960s, there was a company called the Waters Conley Company that was producing a lot of phonographs. And they actually started around this time also with a medical instrument division doing some photo imaging, obviously in support of the medical industry. But that company looked like it had its origins in the early 1900s in Rochester as the Conley Camera Company, started as a camera company and moved into phonographs. And interestingly, the site where that was in 1950, I believe, is now under what is part of the Mayo Clinic today as the Mayo Clinic has expanded. There wasn't much else in the way of manufacturing. I know IBM came into Rochester later in the 1950s. I think the IBM facility began construction in 1954 and opened in 1958, but no sign of that in the 1950 census. The same information in terms of top employers broken out between the city and the rural areas. Not surprising, if you lived in the city of Rochester, medical center, hospital, hotel, and construction were the first 4, followed by the dairy. Percentage-wise, 16% of the people I sampled in the city of Rochester, 16% of the people that had jobs worked for the medical center, and another 7% worked for one of the hospitals. So 23% of the population in Rochester that had jobs, medical. In the rural areas, farming was by far number 1. If you lived in the rural area and had a job, over 2/3 of those people worked on a farm, followed by construction, public schools, hospital, and dairy. It was interesting to me that medical clinic did not come up in the rural areas. So you did see hospital, but if you worked for the medical clinic, you lived in the city. There was not a lot of commuting in from the rural areas to Mayo. I always like to look for some 1950 era images. And so this is just a collage of some vintage 1950 era pictures. The top left and the bottom right, those are both courtesy of the History Center in Olmsted County. just pictures of what downtown Rochester looked in about 1950. Upper middle here, we have St. Mary's Hospital that had just undergone an expansion in 1946. Bottom left here, the Plummer Building, which is a national landmark. And this, again, just prior to the Mayo Building starting construction and opening. Here's a picture of the two gentlemen that won the Nobel Prize in 1950, Edward Kendall on the left and Philip Hinch on the right. Both worked at Mayo. And in upper right is got this from the Mayo site. It's the telegram that Philip Hinch received, letting him know that he was one of three people winning the Nobel Prize, again for cortisone. And then finally, this is just a picture of one of the phonographs coming out from the phonograph factory. So I always also find it very interesting to look at what job titles people had in 1950, and you see definitely some that are sort of titles that are reminiscent of the era, but others are titles that you still see today. I broke the titles, some of the more interesting titles, into three columns here. One, the column on the left, these are all titles. And again, dozens and dozens and dozens of different titles of people that worked in the medical center, but I just give a sample. I would assume most of these are very similar to titles you would see today. Maybe this coding cards, I would guess this is something that was done record keeping wise that computers have replaced. Shoe correctionist, I thought that was an interesting one. That's probably still something that's done there today. Other industries, these first four in the middle column kind of sounded like superheroes to me. There was a flag man, a roundhouse man, a rack man, and a linoleum man. But they all seem to be legitimate jobs. The first two, railroad. The rack man worked at a billiards parlor, and the linoleum man worked at a linoleum shop. We had a lime salesman. I saw some hatchery workers. There was a chicken hatchery in the Rochester area. A couple well drillers. A sheet shaker worked at the laundry. I saw a few construction jobs that involved dynamite. So again, with all the construction going on, there was still blasting going on. Jobs involving dynamite, and there was a neon gas blower working for the neon company. And then on the far right are titles that I see in a lot of the 1950 census that you don't see very often anymore. Elevator man, I'm old enough to still remember buildings that would have a physical person that operated the elevator. So you see a lot of job titles of elevator man, typists, stenographers, switchboard operators, telegraph agent. These are all titles that technology has kind of started doing away with. You don't see these very often anymore. You would see soda jerks. A lot of the drugstores had soda fountains. Greasers was a common title for someone that worked at a garage. Dog catcher, working at the dog pound. And then, signs of the time with again, not a lot of females in the workforce. Oftentimes, if there was a lady or a young girl that was working, there would be the title lady or girl after the name of the title to signify that it was a woman, and you generally don't see those titles anymore. So the other thing that was interesting is obviously with the hospital and medical center, I found dozens and dozens and dozens of physicians and nurses, much more so than I see in other communities I look at. But also interestingly, I found a lot of maids, and I really wasn't familiar with the term child monitors. I typically see babysitters or nannies, but in Rochester, they were all termed child monitors, and dozens and dozens of maids and child monitors, usually working in the homes of the physicians. So I thought that was interesting as well. So now I want to turn the attention to the question, where were you born? And again, this question was asked of everyone in the census. So this pie chart on the left just shows that the big chunk here, 74% of the people in the Rochester area were born in the state of Minnesota. This next piece of the pie, 22%, they were born in another part of the US. and then 4% born internationally. So on the far right here, I just listed if they weren't born in Minnesota, what were the most common answers? And they were all 4 nearby states. So if you weren't born in Minnesota and you lived in Rochester, the first 2 are the 2 nearest states, which you typically see, Iowa and Wisconsin, followed by Illinois and South Dakota. That is almost always the case that I see in the Midwest, is that the most common answer is a border or nearby state. And again, in 1950, a lot of people weren't moving cross country at the time. If you did move, you generally were moving nearby, and we definitely see that in the census results. The next 4 behind these 4 were North Dakota, and then interestingly, Canada was number 6, followed by Michigan, and then Germany. So Canada and Germany were the 2 foreign countries that people were coming to Rochester in 1950. And here it shows that. So again, there weren't a lot of people living in Rochester that were not born in the US, but for those that were born in a foreign country, this gives the top ones. Canada, 28% of the people that were foreign born, followed by Germany, Norway, Sweden, and England. There's a drop off then, but the next 3 were Denmark, Ukraine, which is interesting, and then Ireland. When I look at other Minnesota communities, I almost always see either Germany or Norway number 1 here, but interestingly, in Rochester, Canada was number 1. And I think, again, a lot of that were physicians or medical people moving into Rochester. The question that I find a little more interesting, though, is where your parents were born. And the reason this one's interesting is given, this question, this is starting to capture immigration in the mid to late 1800s and early 1900s. So where were your parents born? And for those that had parents that were not born in the US, by far the number 1 for residents of Rochester at 35% was Germany, followed by Norway, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, England, and Ireland. Probably not too big a surprise. You see the Scandinavian countries and Germany. That's what you would typically see in Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. The 3 Scandinavian countries represented 27%. So when you add Scandinavia and Germany together, 62% of the parents that were not born in the US born there. What you don't see here is any Eastern European countries, and that is different. The top 7 or 8 lists generally in a Midwest community. I might see Poland or Hungary or some other Eastern European countries. Really didn't see any of that in Rochester. Just by way of comparison, in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Norway was 1 and Germany was 2. In Winona, Germany was 1 and England was 2. And then St. Cloud, Germany and Norway were 1 and 2, just like they are in Rochester. So in summary, as we're sort of winding down to the time for Q&A, many of the measures that I looked at, Rochester looked like a typical Minnesota and Midwest community. The exceptions to that, were the income levels and the high levels of education. Again, probably not a surprise to anyone given the strong medical presence. What you did see was a strong difference in a lot of the stats between whether you lived in the city or a rural area, particularly income, education level, and previous military experience. The medical center, hospitals, construction, and hotels were the largest non-farming employers. And there was very, very, very little manufacturing in Rochester, the lowest I've seen of any community of near that size in 1950. Canada, Germany, Norway, and Sweden were the most predominant birth countries for those not born in the US. And then Germany, Scandinavia, Canada, and England and Ireland were the predominant birth countries for parents that were not born in the US. So clearly a dynamic time in Rochester in 1950, just starting the huge growth of the city. driven by expansion of the medical center there. And again, the population growing very rapidly during this period of time. So I enjoyed going through this, researching the Rochester data. I learned a lot. Looks like a great community. Obviously, I assume the economy there has remained very strong in the decades after 1950 with the strong medical presence, which just continues to grow. But hopefully you might have learned something from this, a little bit more about Rochester and Olmsted County. For those of you not familiar with where to find census records, if you're interested in doing more research on the census, I've given the 3 top sites to find data. Ancestry.com is probably the largest and has the best search function. If you do it from home, there is a subscription cost, although most libraries have access to it. FamilySearch.org is a free site run by the Latter-day Saints. You just have to register with them, but it is a free site. You can search the census data. And then the government also has a site. It's a little clunkier to use, but if you're interested in really researching the questions that are asked on the census, this archives.gov is a good site for that. And then finally, before I turn it over to questions, if you do have questions that come up after tonight, please feel free to email me. My email address is scott@ancestralpast.com. I also, about once a month, send out information on a genealogy topic. If you'd like to start receiving those, just drop me an email and I'd be happy to send you that information. And then my last slide just shows the references, the resources that I used in compiling this used a lot of obviously census data, but then also the History Center of Olmsted County and some of your local sites help me supplement the information based on what I learned. So with that, let me stop and open it up for questions.
Okay, so if anybody has questions, let me know, and I'm gonna Scott, can you hear us right now?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. Okay. I'm gonna turn this on. And I will bring the speaker around to make sure he and I also will repeat questions if needed. And those of you in joining us virtually, you can feel free to type out in the chat as well. So we got one.
Hi, Scott. I'm curious to know if you can draw any kind of conclusion as to why there's a lack of immigration from Central and Eastern Europe over to this part of the country.
If I heard the question, reasons why there may have been lack of Eastern European immigration to Rochester. You know, I am guessing here, but guessing based on other research I've done, is that, you know, oftentimes there's what's called chain migration, which, you know, generally, even in the 20th century, people that immigrated to the US were immigrating to communities where either they had family that had immigrated previously, or it was known that there's a community of immigrants from that community. So the answer to the question probably goes back to the early days of Rochester and who settled Rochester initially, which was, I've not researched that, but I assume that a lot of the initial folks moving into Rochester, immigrating into that area, were of Scandinavian and German descent. I tend to see more Eastern European immigration into larger cities. So if you look at Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, you are going to see, you know, much higher Eastern European numbers than smaller cities. Rochester is kind of a mid-sized city. And I will say there was some, so it wasn't like I didn't see any residents that didn't have parents that were born in Poland or Yugoslavia or Hungary. It was just a little bit lower than I typically see in other communities. I would suspect maybe that, coming from the Eastern European countries, a lot of them were filling manufacturing type jobs when they came to the US. And Rochester just didn't have that manufacturing employment base. It was a good question. And if other people know reasons, please chime in as well.
I'm curious also if you were doing this work, if you found any kind of numbers at all with folks immigrating from the southern states.
Yeah, so he was asking whether there was any movement from the southern states to Minnesota, I think in 1950, if I heard the question correctly. I did see some. I want to say of the southern states that Tennessee might have been the most that I saw, but it wasn't a large prevalence. And I did not see a large African-American population in Rochester in 1950. As I've done this in some other communities, I've seen evidence of the Great Migration when a lot of African-Americans were moving from southern states into northern communities to escape Jim Crow and have better life opportunities and better employment opportunities. I saw a little of that in Rochester, but it wasn't a great percentage.
Thank you.
We've got a question here on Zoom. You can probably see them, Scott. Kathy's saying that she would love to hear how things have changed since 1950s. We might, have to wait on the next census for that, right?
Yeah, I really kept my research to 1950, and then just some of the threads that I pulled is when I learned something from the 1950 census, I kind of followed through on some of that, but I didn't really, I did look at like who are the top employers in Rochester today. And obviously, you still see Mayo and the hospital, public schools are still a top employer. There's still not a lot of manufacturing in Rochester. I think there's probably more than there was in 1950. I did see the phonograph company, I think they went out of business in the 1970s. The big thing that I saw how Rochester's changed is it has grown more since 1950 than any other community of a comparable size or larger that I've seen. I see most communities that I've looked at have roughly doubled since 1950, and Rochester's quadrupled. That's probably the biggest difference that I saw.
And then there's one from Dawn on here that Laura kind of had a response to, but Dawn asks, how/why did Congress arrive at the 72-year rule? Any chance that might be changed or lowered?
Yeah, I get that question a fair amount, and I don't have a great answer for why 72. Obviously, that seems like a pretty arbitrary number. And my best answer to that is it feels like it's a compromise, that someone wanted 70, someone else wanted 75, and they settled on 72. I think in general, the general reason for 72 is because there's income, employment, family information. For privacy reasons, they want to wait long enough where that information can't be used in a way that's sort of outside of research purposes. So you would certainly understand people not wanting to have their income out there that are still living today. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people that were in the 1950 census that are still living today. So they may extend this. I don't think they're going to reduce the 72-year rule, at least for a lot of questions. They may extend it. I think in the United Kingdom, if I'm not mistaken, it's a 90-year rule. So you have to wait 90 years in the United Kingdom. So it's longer in other parts. I've not heard of any movement to have that changed right now.
We had another question.
Were you disappointed at the paltry number of questions in the 2020 session?
I was not able to hear that question.
So she asked about if you were disappointed at all in the paltry number of questions in the 2020 census.
And Madeline, if that was you, I had trouble hearing you as well. I
Oh,
still
okay.
didn't get the question.
She asked about the questions in the 2020 census and whether or not you were disappointed by how low of amount of questions there were.
Oh, I mean, yes, as someone that likes to do research from the census, yes. You know, and it does change, you know, every 10 years or so in terms of what questions are on there. It's a bit of the sign of the times. You know, because you know, I don't think I'll be living when the 2020 census is released and I can research it, because that's going to be the year 2092. You know, I haven't thought too much about that. I will say I was disappointed in the 1950 census compared to 1940 in that two really good pieces of information. One, where were your parents born? And then two, what's your income level? Those were asked of everyone in 1940, and they were only asked 1 out of every 5 people in 1950. And so that, you know, depending on who you're searching, you may not be able to find the answer you're looking for there.
I have a question. I do have a question.
Looks like Laura has a question.
I do. Is it possible to go to the National Archives and research a more recent census, like 1960 or 1970, or write to them and pay for a copy of a particular census?
Generally, no, unless you have a specific research purpose that is beyond just wanting to research your own family, for instance.
Oh, so like what, adoption reasons, or like what? What would be a valid reason for getting access to that?
You know, people that are maybe, you know, maybe there is for government reasons, there's a certain question that a consultant's been hired to help figure out. For instance, roads, the impact of new roads in terms of the number of people that lived in certain areas. If there's a function like that, but for individuals researching their family or adoption, they've been pretty strict on that 72-year rule.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Obviously, there are other sources, you know, other sources that you can try to find information. A lot of, for instance, a lot of city directories
Right, you're
are
right.
now online.
And they're annual. A lot of those are annual. So,
Correct.
and some states have intermittent census every 5
Yes.
years, for example. Yeah, so those are good too.
And a lot of states have released birth, death, and marriage records online. So
Mhm.
there are, it's not that you can't find any information going back
That's true.
after 1950, but just the US Census has been a little restricted.
I was researching Indian in the state of Minnesota, and the Bureau, Indian Bureau, they did it annually for Indian families as well. And it was so good for tracking family groups. You know, I mean, a lot of stuff happens in 10 years and
Oh, I know.
it's hard to track family groups sometimes, but with the Indians on reservations, it was annual. It was really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that question.
Okay. I'm done. Yeah.
Any other
yeah.
questions? Any other questions from anybody? No? All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Scott, for taking the time to chat with us today. And I think we all appreciate it. Knowledge.
Yeah, well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank
Enjoyed
you.
learning more about Rochester. And again, if you do have questions that come up later, I'm always happy to answer them. Just drop me an email and I'd be happy to follow up. So thank you, everyone, and you guys enjoy the rest of your evening.
Excellent. I will email you tomorrow, Scott.
All right.
And I think Spencer, the secretary report, I think we can do that. This is as of today.
Good job, bro.
We have 2,036,739 cents. And the number tonight, so it will be 2,056. Welcome to the new number. Yes, Lord.
It's not gonna.
And we added from the different